I think it's fantastic. I think the more that we can expand the reach of psychological services and information through technology, the more we can provide access to people who could not otherwise access our services or information. That's a good thing. And I think technology allows us to do that. I think through some of the new technologies, we're allowing our services to be provided to people in maybe remote areas.
That people are on their smartphone literally 24/7, 365. And so the smartphone can be a good gateway, I think, between the therapist and the client.
I think it's very exciting. It expands our ability beyond just our offices, I think, in terms of communicating with other professionals, with people who perhaps can't make it to our offices. It saves time. And I just think the new technologies that are expanding are very exciting and promising, some of which we don't really use yet in the offices.
I started out being interested in technology when I was training and working in rural psychology. And there's a lot of obstacles for people in rural areas to access mental health care. And so the technology really allows those services to be expanded to them. Also, some special populations, the elderly, prison inmates, have also been able to get some great services through the use of technology, and also some specialized services, consultations through the internet to people that don't have access to those kind of specialized psychological care is also available through technology. So I'm very excited about those possibilities.
There are some pretty interesting options available to therapists, one of which is reminders, both reminders about appointments and times because people tend to forget their appointments with therapists, but also reminders about practicing certain behaviors. So, for example, if you're doing some cognitive behavioral treatments with someone, it might be nice to be able to shoot them a reminder once a day, don't forget to do X, Y, and Z.
I think in the next decade that it will become that if you don't have the technologies, you will be in the minority.
Well, I think one of the ways that technology is now being used is in providing psychological services. As you probably know, there's a number of web-based programs to deal with a number of psychological disorders, some anxiety disorders, depression. It's being used now for post-traumatic stress disorder, for some childhood anxiety issues, for smoking cessation, for weight control. And I think what we find is by giving that information and to the public where they can kind of expand, if you want to think the psychotherapy hour, beyond that hour, to people being able to access that type of information and interventions on as needed basis. I think, that's really good. We're also using technology to do such things as consult with other professionals throughout the world. For example, here at Florida Tech, we have a Center for Autism Treatment. And as you know, autism is a big concern in almost every country now throughout the world. So some of our staff here are consulting with professionals over in Dubai as they begin to start their autism services there on some good ways to improve their services. Another thing that we're doing through the internet is that we're providing training for parents via some web-based modules on how to work with their child with autism. So again, it gives that kind of access and as needed information to individuals.
There are people who live too far away in rural areas where there are no therapists or no therapists that can deal with their specific issues. That's going to be very helpful.
We can treat more people. We can extend the reach to reach those people who cannot come into the office because of a disability or because of their geographic location.
The major strength is what I said earlier, is that it really expands access to people who could not otherwise access it. It also expands the amount of time that people can have access to psychological knowledge and interventions. So can you imagine, most people nowadays, these appointments are hard to arrange. So at 9 o'clock at night saying, what are some of the next steps I can take to really dealing with my social phobia? And they can sit down at their computer and go through a web-based program that takes them step by step through some of the methods that can be used for that individual to improve themselves. I think that's a real strength. I think there are some people that, there still is the stigma of mental health services, and somehow connecting online is either through one of these web-based programs that are more self-initiated, or even through counseling online. There's maybe less of a stigma to approaching it. So I think many people who may not otherwise access that would be more willing to kind of try it out. And what the research shows, and this is often surprising to a lot of folks, is the therapeutic alliance, the sense of connection between the therapist and the client, seems to be as strong via internet counseling as through face-to-face. And many people can't believe that, but that's been shown time and time again.
There's different kinds of online consultations. We use it regularly now, not for patients, and I'll talk about that separate, because I think there's one category that is for supervision. It reduces the barrier in terms of distance and time, and so that's the plus. And also there's some promising research showing that it can be fairly effective in terms of client, but non-client, you can use it for supervision, you can use it for, as I said, for staff meetings, you can use it for online training.
There's a couple of clear ones, and privacy and confidentiality are number 1 and 2 as far as I'm concerned. You don't know who's at the other end of that smartphone. You don't know who's going to read your text message to your client. You don't know who might be taking the measures on the app. You don't know who might be reading them and how that in itself might influence your therapy. And that concerns me, as well as the confidentiality. I mean, most people do not password protect their phones, for example. And that means that anybody that gets your phone can read whatever you write.
There are risks when you don't really know the parameters of how it can be used. You need to know the technology. And I think as psychologists, we need to not only be trained, whether we're clinicians or industrial psychologists or consultants in our field, we also need to be trained in some of the technology.
I think the risks are that people might think it's exactly the same as providing services on a face-to-face basis. To be able to do this requires additional preparation and training. There are a lot of ethical and legal issues that you need to know about and be prepared for. And those are all very doable, but you have to at least know what those are, and not just kind of open up your computer one day and say, "Hey, I'm going to start, doing counseling over the internet." You need to think about by not being in the same room, say with a client, what are some of the safeguards that need to be put in place to protect that client's confidentiality, and in case an emergency happen, what types of things need to be in place in their locale to take care of things?
One of the risks or the problems that I see is that there are so many out there, and there's not much effectiveness data on it, and anybody can really, with the right engineers and software engineers, can create apps. The quality, there's not much quality control.
In my opinion, the key factor is usability. Clinical psychologists are often reluctant to invest the time needed to learn complicated software. Also, with a few exceptions, new technologies are not included in academic programs. So, in order to improve the use of new technologies by psychologists, it is needed to develop more user-friendly software, as well as to adapt the academic programs to include the connections between psychology and technology.
The weakness of the intervention is we must be very careful, and we must do a full evaluation to make sure that the person we're treating isn't at risk without us being there. Because, for instance, if a person is suicidal or in some way unstable and we're treating them online and are not there, and they tell us, I'm going to commit suicide, we need to have a backup plan. We need to make sure that there is some safety net there to help that person in their geographic region.
Another issue about online therapy is that there's a tendency to not pay full attention. When you're in the room with the therapist, your attention theoretically should be on the therapist and the therapist's attention on you. But when you and I started to speak today, I made a point to turn off my email, turn off all of my alerts, all of my reminders. And if you're dealing with people who are constantly multitasking or task switching between the screen, and I have a second screen over here and a third screen over here, and I could be going back and forth, I will not be getting as much from therapy as I would if I was in a dedicated office talking straight to you.
Also, nonverbal. When you're talking with a patient, they have to know how to angle the camera. They have to be fairly savvy in terms of uploads and downloads, and do they have enough bandwidth, and what happens if the call is dropped? How might they interpret it? And then we only see the person sort of, the head. We don't see the whole person. So as a clinician, we lose the ability to really sense all of their nonverbals and their movements, and get a sense, what are their eyes? Do they have glassy eyes? Might they have been drinking? What is their, are there any particular odors that are giving signals? How do they move their hands? How do they move their legs? So we lose some of that, and that's why we really have to be aware.
Unless you know who you're communicating with and you've had experience in the real world, you are dealing in what I would call a very cueless environment.
You may not know who's in the room when you're talking to somebody online. So again, what you try to do is prepare for those type of things, kind of, try to get as much information as that you can up front, and deal with it that way. So I don't see any big weaknesses. Some people feel that things might get too sterile if we're all connecting online rather than face-to-face. And maybe that could be an issue, though the research would not show that there's any less of a connection there.
The other issue, I think, is it causes people to overuse their smartphones. And this is the area that I study, which is, why is it that younger people tend to want to check their smartphones every 15 minutes or less, and particularly check their social media and their text messages every 15 minutes or less, many of whom sleep with their phone either on vibrate or on next to the bed and self-interrupt during the night. So you're dealing with a device that can be both, on the one hand, helpful, and on the other hand, I think it can cause some additional anxiety problems that you may not want to deal with.
In America, the license to practice is state-based. So the regulations are all state-based. So the one difficulty, of course, is that if you're doing things online, states don't make a whole lot of difference. So you could be talking to someone from California or Oregon or Texas, and the important thing to know is what are the regulations in each of those areas. And that's not always easy to get. Your license as a psychologist is also limited to the state in which you have that license. And so just because you have a license, say, here in Florida, doesn't mean that I can counsel somebody out in California. So one of the things our national association is trying to do is to see how we can expand the mobility of our practice so that you would be able to use a license to, on a infrequent basis or for a limited time, provide some consultation out of state. So they're working on that now. That's going to be a long road to get there, but I think that that's promising. The other thing, of course, is insurance payments. Not all insurance companies will pay for online counseling or online consultation. So the method to actually be able to be reimbursed for that work is also different.
The American Psychological Association, for really the past 2 years, has had a task force that is composed of some APA members as well as people from the malpractice insurance, so making sure that, and then some professionals from the regulatory boards. So specifically, it's called the Association for State and Provincial Psychological Boards. And they have been meeting to try to form guidelines. As of this summer, hopefully, the guidelines have been drafted and they need to be approved by APA Council. So I suspect that within a year or less, perhaps within 6 months, there will be guidelines helping psychologists understand what are the factors they need to know about and just guide them in the practice. The difficulty in the US is that I, as a private practitioner, cannot see over the internet a patient, even if a patient of mine, perhaps, I'm right near Washington, D.C., and if a patient goes to Pennsylvania for 3 months, I am not, technically, if I'm not licensed in both states, then I cannot see the patient. And each state has slightly different regulations, but for the most part, we can't cross state lines. Now, if you are in the Veterans Administration psychologist or in the military, they don't have those restrictions. So, and they are actually using much of the mobile apps, as well as virtual reality, as well as video conferencing, telepsychology, because they don't have those limitations. The good news is that this regulatory board are trying to get something called, I don't know if it'll pass, but an e-passport. So that if you are licensed in good standing in your state and then you meet certain criteria, that then you can use this e-passport to treat somebody in another state.
After 2 decades of research, we have enough information now showing that it is possible to improve the efficacy and efficiency of psychological interventions by means of technologies such as virtual reality. We have been using virtual humans to train abilities of diagnosis in psychology students. The diagnostic interview in psychology requires the training of several skills and abilities. However, Interaction with real patients should be avoided during the initial stages of training. Instead, training should be provided under guidance in controlled settings. Virtual Humans technology provides trainees simulations of real-life situations where they can learn by doing in a safe educational context. Furthermore, VR allows to gradually increase the difficulty of the problems in training tasks, facilitating the process of learning by leading students progressively closer to their best performance. We used VR also to train other skills, in particular social skills, in patients with schizophrenia. Moreover, studies suggest that VRQ exposure therapy may be an effective procedure for reducing ED symptoms, especially binge eating episodes. Similar results show that VRQ exposure is an effective technique in smoking cessation programs and in other addictions. VR has been shown to be effective for pain reduction, mainly in experimental studies, but also during painful medical procedures. More specifically, VR has been found to reduce pain intensity, anxiety, distress, and time spent thinking about pain. It has also been demonstrated that the use of VR can increase pain tolerance and pain thresholds. A further point of interest is that VR, virtual reality, rarely produces negative side effects. Indeed, most participants perceive it as enjoyable.
Well, I think where we're seeing the biggest change right now are in apps and being able to build apps for people so that they can make good use of them. For example, there's apps to practice cognitive behavioral processes. There are apps for mindfulness practice. There are apps for practicing relaxation. And so I think those are going to be able to be good in the sense that you have sort of a portable therapist with you.
More people are investing in webcams, which I think can then provide, I mean, like we have high definition webcams in all of our offices. So we have our staff meetings that way, and we use it for supervision, many things. There are new technologies that are, well, some virtual reality is something that has actually been around for probably 15 years. But it's expensive, and it has been expensive, and most clinicians don't use it. I know the military uses it for treatment, and I think now that the cost is getting less, perhaps more people use it. The newest technology, which is very exciting for clinical practice, is called augmented reality. And actually much of the work is done in Europe and New Zealand. But also being developed here in the United States. And I'm very excited about that because that is, for those people who are not familiar with it, it's reality. So it's a picture, for example, someone who is afraid of airplanes would actually be a real background of the real plane and the airport, but superimposed is the digital. And they're interactive features like the video games that
everything is going to go to a mobile platform. So notebooks, iPhones, iPads, smartphones, internet. So we're not going to any longer be tied to our laptop or our desktop computer, but we're going to be able to help our patients anytime, anywhere that they need us by going to mobile platforms.
And I can see that apps are going to be useful in the future. I mean, I think it would be nice, for example, if I were a therapist, to be able to have a client monitor their own moods, for example, on a hour by hour or every few hour basis, reminded by an app to click on, check how depressed you are, how anxious you are, what you're feeling, and very simply take a couple seconds, do it, and then have it transmitted to the psychologist or bring it to the session and discuss the pattern and try to figure out what goes on in the times outside of that 1 hour a week session.
Virtual reality, advanced technologies are just tools. You still must rely on your good clinical skills, your clinical training, and your clinical judgment. So the risk is that we think these tools can somehow make us do things that we couldn't do before. All they do is help us to treat our patients more effectively and more efficiently, but they don't all of a sudden make us an expert in something we knew nothing about.